Okay. One of the lessons I learned from the various conferences is that I never speak after lunch, because you will lost half of the audience. But I think it's it's even worse than speak after buffet lunch. Anyway, okay. The topic of my presentation is South China Sea and China-U.S. relations, and Chris asked me to talk about Beijing's perspective. And the context for this topic is that the growing concerns about emerging Sino-U.S. rivalry that could unsettle the peace and stability in the region. And actually, the emerging rivalry between China and the United States is somewhat puzzling. Where there have long been differences between two countries in their position in the South China Sea. And unlike the issue of Taiwan, Tibet, and even trade dispute for a very long time, and the South China Sea dispute has never assumed a central place in the bilateral relations. Actually, there is speculative and in both countries about the significance about the disputed features in the South China Sea to the respective national interests of both China and United States. So given this, in this context, actually one respected observer on China-U.S. relation, Michael Swan from the Carnegie Institute Foundation, and he puts it, quote, to allow a dispute over a few rocks and islands in the corner of the Asia-Pacific region to derail a vital relationship critical to both regional and global peace and prosperity is a height of folly. End of quote. So in this context, many observers tend to see recent development in the South China Sea through the lens of an intensified zero-sum Sino-U.S. competition for strategic primacy in the region. For example, Hill White, a prominent Australian scholar of strategic affairs, argues the key to understanding what is happening now in the South China Sea is to recognize it has almost nothing to do with the disputed reefs and rocks themselves. It has everything to do with a deadly, serious rivalry between the world's two strongest powers, determining who set the rules in Asia and who enforce them. So in the similar vein, Peter Jennings, the executive director of Australian Strategic Policy Institute, noted that a new Cold War-type rivalry is emerging between China and the United States, chiefly because of their incompatible strategic interest in the South China Sea. And there is a growing concern that the increasingly hostile actions displayed by the military on both sides in South China Sea in recent years may cause an intended arms clash, and which could escalate into a fatal major war between the two countries. So in this context, a long-term China watcher in the United States, David Lampton, warned that Sino-U.S. relationship is reaching a tipping point to a dangerous strategic competition unseen before since 1972. So for many observers outside China, recent tensions between China and the United States in South China Sea has been essentially caused by Beijing's ambition to challenge Washington's long-standing leadership in the region. For some, China's assertive and even cohesive behavior in promoting its interest and agenda in the South China Sea represent a grave challenge to the rule-based international order and well-accepted international norms and law. Others, however, are more sympathetic to China's position. While agreeing that China's recent behavior is decidedly destabilizing, they tend to see that China is just doing what a typical rising power in the history would and actually should do, that is to maximize its power and security through regional dominance. So for those scholars, instead of seeing the current tension as a struggle for international rules, norms, or laws, U.S.-China competition is essentially a replay of classical great power politics. There are still others who believe that China's growing assertiveness in recent years has been driven by Beijing's flawed assumption that the United States is a rapidly declining power. And as two respected observers claim, after 2008-2009 financial crisis, Chinese analysts mistakenly concluded that the United States was in terminal decline, and that China's moment has come to undo a century of humiliation. So regardless of this different view, and all these scholars share a common position that the current tension and in the South China Sea was caused by China's challenge to United States. So to what extent has China's recent assertive and increasingly uncompromising action in South China Sea been driven by intention to challenge the United States? And how does China see the growing involvement of US in the South China Sea dispute, and how important the South China Sea dispute in China's overall relationship with the United States and in its foreign policy? So in this paper, what I'm going to do is that to address these questions through an examination about the Chinese perspective. And so the main finding, and by examining the Chinese literature and those statement articles and by the Chinese analysts, Chinese leaders, and the various conversations I have had over the, many conversations with the Chinese analysts. What I found is that there is a significant and actually widening gap between Chinese view and the external perceptions with regard to the nature and course of China's action in the South China Sea and the role of United States. And such a perception gap have not only contributed to the recent tensions in the Sino-U.S. relations, but also pose obstacles to the management of the already complicated dispute. If left unaddressed, and it could lead to a dangerous escalation of a rivalry that both Beijing and Washington seek to avoid. So what exactly China's view about the current situation in the South China Sea and in its relationship with the United States? Actually, like many people outside China, Chinese leaders and foreign policy analysts are well aware and indeed increasingly worried about an emerging Sino-U.S. rivalry. And this is reflected in the fact that ever since Chinese President Xi Jinping came to power, avoiding a Thucydides trap in the Sino-U.S. relations has been a repeated theme in his discussion with his American counterpart, President Obama. During Xi Jinping's first visit in October 2013 to the United States, after assuming the role of president only 3 months, Xi Jinping stated that both China and the United States need to work together to avoid the so-called Thucydides trap, that is, destructive tensions between an emerging power and established power. 2 years later, during his first formal state visit to the United States, in the speech on Sino-U.S. relations, he expressed with great concerns about the state of Sino-U.S. relation, stating that while there is no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world, but should a major country made the mistake of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves. But the recent development in the South China Sea has had some Chinese scholars convinced that the Sino-U.S. rivalry is not just a possibility, but actually happening. For example, in the aftermath of the recent ruling delivered by the arbitration tribunal on the Philippines case against China, and a prominent Chinese scholar, Wu Shicun, the president of China's National Institute for South China Sea Study, observed with great worry that China and the United States is now on the edge of great power rivalry and strategic competition in the South China Sea. He warns that if China and the United States continue to move to the direction of direct confrontation, it will have disastrous consequences for regional peace and stability. But unlike many external observers, Chinese foreign policy elite generally see the recent tensions in South China Sea has largely caused by the United States' growing meddling in the dispute due to its intention to constrain China's growing power and influence in the region. So from Beijing's point of view, the year 2010 is a watershed in US policy towards South China Sea, when the then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made a statement in the ASEAN regional forum meeting of that year in Hanoi, declaring that the US has a national interest in the South China Sea. It is generally believed in China that since then, the US policy in the South China Sea has not only shifted from a previous neutral position to explicitly siding with some claimant states such as the Philippines and Vietnam in their dispute with China, but also the US has recently directly involved in the dispute through increased military activity. And such activity include intelligence collection and surveillance in waters close to China's coast and increased frequencies of joint military exercises in the South China Sea. It is thus not surprising that Beijing sees that the United States has been the chief instigator behind the arbitral case filed by the Philippines against China and UNCLOS. So immediately after the award delivered by the arbitration tribunal in July, a respected Chinese scholar argues that not only the case has been carefully planned by the United States, but its outcome was also deeply influenced, if not imposed, by the United States. And the sweeping legal victory for the Philippines in the award further reinforced the Chinese view that the ruling was manufactured by the United States. And even those Chinese scholars who were critical of Beijing's position of not participating in the arbitration process has also begun to question both the legality of the award and the true intention of the United States after the ruling. So for Beijing, the perceived shift in US policy towards South China Sea has fundamentally driven by Washington's broad objective to maintain its hegemonic position in the region. And more specifically, it is perceived that the growing involvement of the United States in South China Sea aims to ensure the so-called freedom of navigation, to maintain and reinforce the solidarity of US-led alliance system, and to ensure its position as a role maker in the regional security affairs. And many Chinese analysts also see US changing South China Sea policy as a key part of its broader rebalance to Asia strategy, which aimed at counterbalance China's growing power and influence. And some Chinese scholars argue under the Obama administration, US policy toward China undergone a fundamental shift, whereas the previous policy under the Clinton and Bush administration focused on shaping China's behavior largely through inducement. The policy under Obama administration has become one of the outright balancing and through cohesion and deterrence. And in this context, some Chinese scholars argue that the South China Sea dispute has become a convenient stepping stone for the United States to return to Asia. So, given this, and the Chinese analysts generally see China's action in the South China Sea in recent years has largely been defensive, driven by the need to protect China's legitimate national interest. Indeed, while many Chinese analysts acknowledge that China's behavior in the South China Sea has become more assertive and uncompromising than before, they believe that such stances better protect China's territorial and maritime interests against the encroachment of other countries and it's actually more effective than China's previously more consolidatory policy and in the early 2000s. So in this case, instead of seeing that China's tough actions would cause tensions, some Chinese scholars even argue those policy has been more effective in shaping a stable situation in the South China Sea by effectively deterring some other claimant from taking actions harming Chinese national interest. Actually, a prominent Chinese scholar pointed out since later 2014, Vietnam and the Philippines stopped physical confrontation in the South China Sea with China. And also since China's large-scale land reclamation project and all other countries has to stop their own land reclamation project. So they assessed China's policy and tough stance actually successfully and protect China's interest. So it should be noted that despite of its growing assertiveness, and Beijing doesn't want the South China Sea issue dominate and derail its broader relationship with the United States. And China is keenly aware that a stable and cooperative relationship with Washington is fundamental to China's rise. So as mentioned earlier, that the Chinese leader and analyst has become increasingly worried about the emerging Sino-U.S. rivalry. So the concept of a new types of great power relationship was thus initiated by China with the aim to put the relationship on the more manageable path. So in his meeting with the U.S. President Obama in Sunnyland, California in June 2013, Xi Jinping proposed the idea of new types of great power relation, which will be defined by three essential elements: non-conflict and non-confrontational, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. And similarly, China also doesn't want the South China Sea issue to disrupt its overall foreign policy objective that is still to remain a peaceful and stable external environment. But China found to maintain a peaceful and external environment, and on the one hand, and to protect its self-perceived co-national interests on the other hand, is a hard balance. And so for some Chinese scholar, and such a dedicated balance has been phrased as maintaining the regional stability to the extent without damaging China's national interest. At the same time, defending China's national interest to the extent without causing conflict. And this is, however, easily said than done. So briefly, to conclude that there is Chinese and external perceptions differ sharply on the nature and cause of the recent tensions in the South China Sea. And actually, given the wide perception gap, and Beijing and Washington face the real danger of being trapped into a vicious security dilemma caused by the missuspicion. So I will stop here.